Okay, we are back for part 2 of chapter 7, talking about identifying and arresting suspects. So we had talked a little bit about, or we were on the subject of surveillance. We talked a little bit about what surveillance is, and then some of the objectives of surveillance. So now let's talk a little bit about kind of the overall essence of surveillance, if you will. So, one thing to remember, especially when it comes to undercover work, is that it is extremely tedious work. It comes with long hours of preparation. A lot of these operations can be a little bit expensive. It's definitely dangerous. And there really is no such thing as routine when it comes to undercover assignments, um, conducting surveillance, or even more specifically, raids. I have a link to a undercover drug buy on that you can take a look at, and it's actually um, extremely. You're going to stress out when you watch it because sometimes these things happen, and luckily everything turned out okay in this case. But it might help you add some context and help you really understand that it's kind of a dangerous, or can be a dangerous assignment. Okay, so now let's kind of get deeper into surveillance and talk about the different players. So the surveillant is the plainclothes investigator who makes the observation. Surveillance must be prepared for, again, tedium, or the fact that it's a tedious process. No other assignment requires as much patience and perseverance while demanding alertness and readiness to respond. Surveillance, or the undercover operator, the detective, must display ingenuity in devising a cover for the operation. Lack of resourcefulness in providing adequate answers at a moment's notice can really jeopardize the entire case. So you have to kind of be ready for anything. The most successful surveillance or operators, they don't attract attention to themselves. They kind of just blend into that whatever populace that they're working on. So it is a difficult assignment. So the surveillant is that plainclothes investigator who makes that observation. Ingenuity, patience, blending in. Now the subject, well, this is the person who or what is being observed, because it can be a place. Usually suspects in a crime. So it can be a person, a place, property, a vehicle, a group of people, an organization, like even a gang, or an object. And people under surveillance are usually suspects in a crime, or their associates are. And surveillance of places generally involves a location where a crime is expected to be committed. The residence of a known criminal, or a place suspected of, let's say, harboring criminal activities, like a drug house or a gambling house, or even a place of prostitution. So that's kind of the subject. And when we talked about blending in, and here are a few of officers that I had worked at that are undercover detectives. They're not undercover anymore, which is why I can show you the photos. But again, they have to play the part, and you have to know what the crime is, what you're going for, and this is kind of what you end up with. But we have Mr. Partida here, who speaks fluent Spanish, can get into any nightclub where there's a lot of drugs being sold, etc. You have kind of the old guy that looks like the biker. You have sort of the New York Rico Suave kind of looking dude. Yeah, I know. with the little thing hanging down there. But again, it's playing the part for what you need. And here's Johnny again. And the operator on the right is Cindy. And she did a great job and has always done a great job because she blends in it where she goes. I'm trying to think of the name of that there's a couple of big concerts out in like Indio, out that way, and the name of it will come to me. But they always call for her every year to go out there and buy drugs because she fits into kind of the crowd, if you will. So again, you have different individuals for different assignments, kind of based on what you're going to try to go for. And undercover officers, they love to take glory photos like you're seeing here. So a picture of a marijuana grow. Here they're after heroin. You can see all the heroin balloons and on all the money. Larger organizations that deal in large quantities of cocaine. Here's the mark of the brand of the cartel that's moving this type of product. Again, another grow. So again, you saw some pictures of the actual people that did the work. So what about the types of surveillance? So we know the operator side, we kind of know what the subject is, but now what are some types? Well, the type of surveillance used depends on the subject and the objective of the surveillance. In general, surveillance is either stationary or moving. So stationary surveillance, or what we call fixed surveillance, and sometimes they call it plant surveillance or a stakeout, maybe you've heard that before, is used when you know or suspect that a person is at or will come to a specific location. And hopefully that kind of makes sense. So you already know you're targeting more the location, or you're waiting for this particular person to come to a location to maybe drop something off, or to pick something up, or where an actual crime might be taking place. Now, on the other hand, moving surveillance, this is where the subjects of moving surveillance are typically, they're always people. So the first step in planning this type of surveillance is to obtain as much information about the person that you're going to be following as possible. So view photographs, and if possible, and personally observe the subjects if you can. Try to memorize their physical descriptions and form a mental image of them, and maybe even the vehicles that they drive. Concentrate on their appearance from behind, as this is the view that you're kind of going to see a lot of times. But if you're following a car, then you want to really concentrate on the car. So with that, there are different types of moving surveillance. And we're going to kind of talk about those now. But first, just know this. Other problems of moving surveillance are losing the person, and or possibly having the subject that you're surveilling recognize you. Sometimes it's not important if the subject knows of the surveillance. And this is often true of, let's say, material witnesses the police are protecting. They don't care if you're following and protecting you. And it's also true of, let's say, organized crime figures who typically know that they're going to be under constant surveillance. They're always going to be watched. So in such instances, a rough surveillance or open surveillance is used. So you need not take extraordinary means to remain undetected. The major problem of a rough surveillance is that it is liable to change or to charge. The person's going to make me charge, police harassment or invasion of privacy, because they kind of know that you're following them. But at other times, it's more important to remain undetected. than to keep the subject under constant observation. And in this case, a loose surveillance is used. So maintaining a safe distance, let's say 1 or 2 vehicles behind the subject, and kind of hand off the subject to another officer after maybe the suspect takes a turn, so another car picks it up. And if the suspect is lost during this type of surveillance, you can usually relocate the subject and resume your surveillance. This type of loose surveillance is often used when you need general information about the subject's activities or associates. Now, often, however, it's extremely important not to lose the subject and have a very close, tight surveillance. And that's the last one. That's the close or the tight surveillance. So on a crowded street, this means staying within a few steps of the person. But on a less crowded street, it means keeping that person in your sight line. A close surveillance is most commonly used when you know the subject is going to commit a crime, when you must know the subject's exact habits, or when knowledge of the subject's activities is important to another critical operation. So close surveillance is also best done with multiple officers, if you have them. So if he turns a corner, somebody else on the corner can pick up that surveillance. So that way, if he were to look back, he doesn't see the same person all the time. So you have to kind of, understand that. So those are the different types. So criminals, because, while we think that they're not always smart, sometimes they actually think a little bit. They're often suspicious of these stakeouts or of being followed. And they may actually send someone out to scout the location to see if there's law enforcement there on a stakeout. So they'll go out and see if people are hanging around. And they may have someone following them as well to see if they're being followed. And that's kind of counter surveillance. That's the practice of avoiding surveillance or making it hard, or actually trying to see if someone's surveilling you. Counter surveillance techniques can be making a quick right turn, or making a quick left turn, or maybe running a red light, just barely to see if somebody will follow you quickly through the intersection, or circling the block a couple of times, or even parking or stopping and seeing if somebody stops behind you or if they just continue by you. So these are all counter surveillance techniques, but it's the practice of avoiding surveillance by making it hard. And, along with that, surveillance has become, sophisticated. And surveillance equipment has become sophisticated. Things like binoculars, telescopes, night vision, video system, body wires, costumes, disguises, and now drones. We have all of these different things. We have remote motion detectors that activate the system to videotape an area that's under surveillance. We have GPS technology, as already mentioned, that can be used in surveillance operations, but we do have to understand the restrictions on those as well. So there's a lot of different types of technology that we have. We even have different outfits or costumes that we can wear. Another thing, which I kind of touched on, would be the use of global positioning systems, GPS technology. The case law that kind of talks about that is United States versus Jones, that talks about the limitations on tracking an individual or actually applying a tracking device to somebody's vehicle. We have aerial surveillance. may provide information about areas that are inaccessible to foot or vehicle surveillance. And usually around, 1,000 feet, they don't violate any privacy rights. So you can fly over someone's property at about 1,000 feet and you're probably okay. But again, these are you've got this different types of surveillance, these methods that you can use. Sometimes if we're on a big narcotics surveillance, we might have the helicopter way up in the air following the person so we don't lose them in traffic. So again, you have the use of aerial surveillance. Now we have the use of drones. So we have aerial surveillance that we can use with drones. Kind of an interesting thing. So check out the case Florida versus Riley. But this is something that's becoming quite a bit more prevalent in policing, not just to scout areas or to look for lost people on these mountainsides and things like that, but also to surveil locations or even people. We also have the use of surveillance video. Video images are often used as evidence in high-profile investigations. And there's thousands of crimes that are caught on video each year. A lot of high crime areas, such as those that are commonly used for illegal drug sales, you might be able to post a camera there. They're increasingly being monitored by 24/7 surveillance cameras that are put up on utility poles. Buildings and other strategic vantage points have cameras. And these cameras can be either hardwired or even wireless. So you've got all of this different technology out there. You look at the two pictures here where you have the robbery of the food place and you have a liquor store. We have the technology now to where if these locations have cameras, if they will give us the camera IP address, law enforcement from a computer in the car, we can actually enter the IP address and we can observe what's happening inside of the store at real time. Okay. I just have to say it like this. We didn't have that shit back when, early on. This is up-to-date, awesome technology where you can look at a live feed inside of a store and look at the criminals do whatever they're doing at the time it's happening. And it's super exciting to know that we've come that far, but we do have to understand limitations, right? And do whatever we're doing within the parameters of the law. So we talked about, surveillance in high drug areas by putting these cameras. A lot of times in high graffiti areas, they'll put these cameras that might be motion censored. They'll put these in parks. The department I was at had a camera system that while it was monitored by the school district, it was police cameras, and they could live feed at the parks, at any of our parks, and see exactly what was happening at the parks, like in the middle of the night. So again, great technology. We talked about surveillance maybe at a gang funeral. Talking a little bit more, audio or electronic surveillance. So in special circumstances, electronic devices are used in electronic surveillance. And this includes things like wiretapping or wiring up a person who's going to go into a room or a place to talk to a person so you can get information, or even bugging a room, as they call it, or wiretapping a phone. So just so you know, a body wire would be something that an undercover officer or an operative, even a CI, we would wire them up, or the wire could actually be a pager. It could be a little camera and a baseball cap. It could be in a bunch of different things, but they would go into a location, have a conversation with the suspect, and we would either record it or we would actually monitor it live. So that's pretty cool. Bugging a room is a little bit different, where you go inside and you set up a surveillance system inside of a room, and you're going to need a warrant for something like that. Or wiretapping of a phone. You're going to need a warrant for that, where you can listen in on conversations. A case that's affiliated with these types of electronic surveillance devices would be Katz versus United States. So again, police can wire a person up to talk to a suspect or even record a person without their consent, because there's no expectation of privacy. It's kind of a long story, but they call it, you have to beware of who you're talking to. So if you're willing to talk to somebody, you have to just hope that that person doesn't turn that information over or is working for law enforcement. So police can record a conversation in their patrol cars as well. So if you have two suspects, let's say you arrest a couple of robbery suspects, you can put a tape recorder in the back of your car under the seat. And if the suspects get in the back seat, you can actually leave the car for a minute. And if they start talking, you can record that conversation because there's no expectation of privacy. Kind of interesting, huh? Same with an interview room. If you have multiple suspects, let's say two that did a robbery or even a murder, and you take them to the station and you put them in the same interview room, you can videotape and record their conversation. So when they start talking about how they're not going to, don't say anything, don't say anything, they don't have any evidence on us, they don't know what we did, all that stuff, that's all admissible stuff. So these are things that we can actually do. So this is the audio or electronic surveillance. So throughout the discussion on surveillance, remember, of the most importance here is that balance between acting without violating someone's rights and the need for police to do their job. So there is a balance that we really need to strike. A couple other interesting types of surveillance would be thermal imaging. So that's where you would take a heat device, a heat detecting device. And if you were, if you stood outside of somebody's house, especially at night, would there be heat emanating from the house? Meaning, do they have these big heat lamps in there because they're growing marijuana? Now, with thermal imaging, the courts have said that you need a warrant for that. Now, you don't need a warrant to use it outside if somebody, let's say, is hiding in a backyard, or if somebody runs through a field and you shine the thermal imager down on the grass and you can see the footprints. That you don't need a warrant for. We talked about the automatic license plate readers. You don't need a warrant for that. So, again, different technology, but you have to know the limitations. Again, talking about undercover assignments. The non-uniformed or plainclothes investigator is in a great position to observe illegal activities and obtain evidence. And probably one of the best cases I think I've ever seen is the case that you have right here. This is a murder for hire case where this young lady decides to hire an undercover officer to kill her husband. It's a fantastic video. And if you watch it, start to look for anything that you might think that might be that the officer shouldn't do. But it is a great case, and I can tell you right up front, everything was done in conjunction with the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. Everything was great in this case. But it's a great case to watch as it relates to undercover. So, just kind of understand that, an example could be, again, a male plainclothes officer may appear to accept the solicitation of a prostitute. Or a plainclothes officer may attempt to buy stolen property or drugs. Many activities require little more than simply not smelling like the law. And unlike other forms of surveillance in which a prime objective is not to be observed, undercover surveillance makes personal contact with that suspect using an assumed identity, or what we call cover. So, that's kind of the reason for undercover. And there's a myth out there that if somebody asks you if you're a police officer, you have to tell them. That's not true because it's undercover. That would blow the undercover part. So you don't have to tell anybody that you're an undercover officer, and actually that would jeopardize your safety. So the objective of an undercover assignment may be to gain a person's confidence or to infiltrate an organization or group by using an assumed identity, and to thereby obtain information or evidence connected with the subject of that criminal activity. So you can, again, use that assumed identity or cover. And you can use deception as to identity, and you can use deception as to purpose. So we a lot of times will have female officers that will pose as prostitutes. And that's the deception. And the males will solicit them, and they'll come into a room and they will be arrested. So, and it can be the other way around. We can have a male officer driving around in a vehicle pulling up to an actual prostitute with the intent to arrest the prostitute. So you can switch these roles around again. So you're allowed the deception as to identity and to purpose. And a lot of times we're also going to use rookie officers. We don't always, but sometimes, depending upon what we're doing, we will, because they haven't been seen as much as the other officers, so they won't be recognizable. Okay, so again, undercover assignments designed to obtain evidence for prosecution, obtain leads into criminal activities, check the reliability of witnesses or informants, gain information about a location for later use for a search warrant or a raid, check the security of a person's sensitive position, or obtain information on or evidence against some type of subversive group like a terrorist organization or a gang. So these are the objectives of undercover assignments. So again, locating evidence for prosecution, obtain leads for criminal activity, check on the reliability of informants, gain information about a place, a location, check the security in a highly sensitive position, and also obtain information about groups. Think back to the gang photo that I showed you at the funeral. That would be obtaining information about a group. Okay, and part of undercover assignments comes with the possibility of what we call entrapment. So the Supreme Court has defined entrapment in this case called Sorrells versus United States. The conception and planning of an offense by an officer and his procurement of its commission by one who would have perpetrated it except for the trickery, persuasion, or fraud of the officer. And the Sorrell case also explained the need for trickery in obtaining evidence. And the court said it like this: society as it is at war with the criminal classes, and the courts have uniformly held that in waging this warfare, the forces of prevention and detection may use traps, decoys, and deception to obtain evidence of the commission of a crime. So Sorrells concludes, the fact that the government agents merely afford opportunities or facilities for the commission of the offense does not constitute entrapment. So entrapment is where the government basically influences an individual to commit a crime who typically would not commit a crime, if that definition kind of makes sense. And in another case, Sherman versus United States, they say here entrapment occurs when the criminal conduct was the product of the creativity or the creative activity of the police. So again, entrapment is something that we have to watch for, because we don't want to induce somebody, someone that typically wouldn't be involved in criminal activity, into actually committing some type of criminal activity. And some of these we find, I have some videos that you can watch. I have a video of what we call a reverse sting. It's an undercover sting. Here's another undercover sting. So watch those, and you tell me, or you just kind of think to yourself, hey, is there any type of entrapment there? And probably one of the better things I can talk about with entrapment, and then I'm going to move on, would be, have you ever watched the TV show Bait Car? So in Bait Car, they basically take a vehicle, they put video and audio in it, and they have a kill switch in it, and it also locks the windows and doors. So they take this vehicle to an area that's typically where a lot of auto thefts tend to hang out, or a lot of gang members, criminals, etc. And they'll pull up and they'll leave the vehicle parked there, but they leave the keys in the car and they shut the doors. And at some point, someone will get in the car and start it and drive off. And then they will follow the person. They'll hit the kill switch. The doors lock. The windows won't roll down. The camera starts rolling, and the police swoop up and arrest the person. Is that entrapment? I just want you to think about it. We're not going to answer the question right now. I just kind of want to put it into your mind. All right, so enough about that. Let's move on to raids and talk just a little bit about that. So a police raid is a planned, organized operation based on the element of surprise. And typically, law enforcement will consider all other alternatives before they execute a raid. And the objective of these raids are to recover stolen property, seize evidence, or arrest a suspect. And sometimes all three objectives are accomplished in a single raid. Now, the first consideration is whether there are alternatives to the raid. A second consideration is the level, or not level of safety, but also the legality of the raid. So, again, we have to kind of understand all of the dynamics as a raid. So to plan a raid, you're going to gather as much information on the location as possible. You're going to keep the raid plan as simple as possible. The rationale in executing a raid, surprise, shock, and speed are the essential elements of a raid. And again, a raid should occur only after a careful briefing of all members of the raid party. And each participant must definitely know their objective, who the suspect is, or what the evidence or property is sought, and the exact plan of the raid itself. So, again, surprise, shock, speed, ensure the raid is legal, and make sure that you brief every member. As it really, and a lot of times these raids are done by SWAT teams. So let me read you really quick some precautions regarding raids, and then we're going to move on to SWAT. So some of the precautions in conducting raids would be to first ensure that it's legal, plan carefully, assign adequate personnel and equipment, thoroughly brief every member of the party that's involved in the raid, or the search warrant as we call it, and be aware of the possibility of surreptitious surveillance devices like cameras or even booby traps at that person's location. Now, SWAT teams a lot of times are the ones that serve these search warrants or carry out these raids. And many police agencies have developed tactical squads, sometimes called special weapons and tactics teams, to execute these types of raids. And these units are also considered kind of paramilitary type police units. However, they are thoroughly trained to search areas for criminals, handle any type of sniper incidents or any type of hostage situations. They execute arrest and search warrants, and they apprehend militants who have barricaded themselves inside of buildings. So again, these are and because they have the training time and the tools, typically these teams are called because the average police officer doesn't have the tools, the time, or the training to deal with these types of high-level situations. Okay, so kind of just finishing up a few things and we'll be done. Let's talk just briefly about legal arrests. So once a suspect has been located and identified, the next step is generally an arrest. Now, an arrest is a type of seizure, and like a search, is restricted by the Fourth Amendment and requires probable cause. And we've learned that in previous chapters. And just as state laws define and establish the elements of crimes, they also define arrest and establish who may make an arrest, for what offenses, and when. And most state laws define an arrest in general terms, like the taking of a person into custody in the manner prescribed or authorized by law for the purpose of presenting that person before a magistrate to answer for the commission of a crime. So an arrest may be made by a police officer or even a private person. It may be made with or without a warrant, although a warrant is generally preferred because this places the burden of proving that the arrest was illegal on the defense, if you will. Now, most arrests are typically misdemeanors, such as, maybe drunk driving or vandalism or theft, minor drug offenses, or other kind of simplistic crimes. So again, consider, the powers to arrest or search. They're restricted by the Fourth Amendment. And make sure that what you're doing is going to be legal. Now, as it relates to residences, we talk about residential entry after outdoor arrest. So, entry incident to an outdoor arrest, you're going to need either a search warrant or consent. You can't just run up into somebody's house, right? We've kind of talked about that before. We may need consent, and if we have consent, I would definitely suggest that somebody accompany you inside of a house. And again, so we're talking about residences. When we talk about things like off-duty arrests, make sure you understand the department's policy. Understand your legal jurisdiction. Make sure that you perceive the immediate need to make this off-duty arrest, and make sure that you possess the proper identification. Because every department has a policy really that follows off-duty arrests. And, again, you want to make sure that you're avoiding, all the liability issues and things that come along with that. And speaking of liability issues, there are many that are affiliated with, false arrest, use of force, less lethal weapons, types of restraints, use of deadly force, and then, of course, making sure that you're filling out all of your use of force reports as well. All right, so we went through a lot of information, and I appreciate you sticking with me. Most of it was focused around, again, the basic, identifying and arresting suspects. But in summary, developing, locating, and identifying and arresting suspects, those are the primary responsibility of investigators. Use a lineup identification when the suspect is in custody. Make sure you exhaust all alternatives before using surveillance, undercover agents, or using a raid, if you will. and in making an arrest, use only as much force as is necessary. I didn't cover all of the use of force issues just because time doesn't really permit me to do so. So I would suggest that you go back through in just a little bit and look at a couple of the use of force issues that are listed there. So with that being said, that's going to conclude part 2 of chapter 7, identifying and arresting suspects. So until next time.